In a patriarchal world, most cases of violence and mayhem are carried out by men. This is why it is often shocking when women are not the victims, but are the oppressors instead. As they are called the weaker sex, one might expect women to be less likely to commit heinous crimes and atrocities. Yet the likes of Nancy Hazel and Mary Bell are proof that age or gender does not stop one from being a psychopath or a menace to society. It did not matter if the victims turned out to be their own families. Come with us on this episode as we explore the lives of the world's most dangerous women held in captivity. Janine Jones. It is unusual for a woman to be convicted of a crime as serious as murder. It is even worse when the victims of those crimes are children. Janine Jones, a pediatric nurse, committed the worst crime anyone can imagine in 1982. She was tried and convicted for the murder of children under her care as a licensed vocational nurse. At first, no one bothered too much when children and infants under treatment at the pediatric intensive care unit suddenly died or slipped into critical states, even after being stabilized. But when it appeared to happen only when one nurse was on duty, it became more than a coincidence. It was only through the observations of Susana Maldonado, a 25-year-old registered nurse at the same hospital, that Jones became a subject of investigation. According to Maldonado, too many babies and children were dying in the ICU. They were dying of something minor, and it occurred only when one nurse was on shift. Jones. They called it the death shift. After a series of probing, the hospital decided to force all its vocational nurses to resign, filling the hospital with registered nurses instead. This meant Jones had to leave the hospital, and when she did, the unexplained deaths of children in the ICU stopped. Unfortunately, Jones did not stop with her wicked schemes. She continued her experimentation on children in her new place of work at a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas. It was in this clinic that her actions were finally discovered. The doctor noticed 2 puncture marks on a bottle of succinylcholine, a powerful and dangerous drug also known as anactine. This temporary paralytic drug causes paralysis of skeletal muscles and inhibits breathing. It is powerful enough to induce cardiac arrest when used on children due to the lack of oxygen. But for Jones, it was an instrument of doom. Only Jones and the doctor had access to this drug in the clinic. Following this discovery, the authorities arrested, questioned, and tried Jones for poisoning children. Although the exact number of children who died as a result of Jones's horrific act was not known, it was estimated to be around 60. To prevent further lawsuits, hospitals where she worked either misplaced or destroyed the records of her activities. Jones was sentenced to 99 years in prison in 1985 for the murder of a 15-month-old child with succinylcholine. She was subsequently charged with intentionally and knowingly harming and killing 5 other children by injection with succinylcholine or other harmful drugs. Due to a Texas law that was meant to prevent overcrowding in prisons, Jones was initially meant to be released in 2018 after serving only 1/3 of her sentence, but more charges placed against her to prevented her release. As of 2020, Jones pled guilty to another charge of murder against an 11-month-old child in 1981 and got a life sentence. She is currently serving time at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and will not be eligible for parole till 2037. Nancy Hazel. The true story of Nancy Hazel sends a feeling of shock and fear in the minds of people who hear about her crimes. This woman was also known as Nanny Doss, or the Giggling Granny, because she looked just like a regular grandmother who loved her family. Sadly, Nancy was known for killing at least 11 people, including her husbands, her grandchild, and even her mother. Now, what could possibly drive a woman to commit such atrocities against her own family and blood? During her trial, Nancy blamed her actions on a mental issue caused by a blow to the head when she was young, but her claim was overturned as she was proven to be completely sane. Although she did suffer a blow to the head on a train ride with her family when she was 7, Nancy's actions were purely intentional and may have been born from her hatred of her abusive father. In Nancy's early years, She and her mother Louisa hated her father, James. He was abusive and would not allow his children to go to school. This caused Nancy and her siblings to have poor academic backgrounds. In 1921, at the age of 16, Nancy got married to her first husband, Charlie Braggs, after dating for only a few months. The couple had to move in with Bragg's mother after they got married. However, Nancy disliked the situation and her new mother-in-law. After having 4 daughters, both Nancy and Braggs became miserable, with the former becoming heavily addicted to smoking and drinking. Both partners suspected each other of cheating, and shortly after, their 2 middle daughters died of suspected food poisoning. Braggs abandoned Nancy with their youngest daughter Florine, taking the oldest, Melvina, along with him for a year. During his absence, his mother died of unknown causes, and when he returned, the couple finally divorced. In 1929, Nancy met and married her second husband, Robert Franklin Harrelson, who she would murder by poisoning in 1945, after 16 years. Before that, Nancy collected a $500 life insurance on her grandson after the boy died mysteriously under her care. But the sheer horror of Nancy's actions would not end there. She got married 3 more times, murdered each of her husbands, and cashed out the insurance money she put on them and their properties until she was apprehended after the death of her last husband, Samuel Doss. The manner and sudden death of Doss prompted his doctor to perform an autopsy. With the discovery of heavy doses of arsenic in his system, Nancy was ultimately arrested. After her arrest, she confessed to the killing of her own mother, her sister, 4 of her husbands, her mother-in-law, her daughters, and her grandson. She was prosecuted and sentenced to life imprisonment on May 1955, primarily for the murder of her last husband, Doss, but was not given the death penalty due to her sex. While in prison, Nancy died of leukemia in 1965 and is interred at the Oak Hill Memorial Park. Aileen Waros. America's first female serial killer, Aileen Waros, had it rough her whole life, and the choices she made because of that showed how little she valued life. Born in 1956 to divorced teenage parents, Diane Waros and Leo Pittman, Aileen never met her father as he was sentenced to life in prison after assaulting a 7-year-old girl and ended up committing suicide by hanging himself in prison. After she and her older brother Keith were abandoned by their mother Diane in 1960, Aileen and Keith were legally adopted by their maternal grandparents Lori and Britta. You might assume things would get slightly better at this point, but sadly, it became worse for the kids, especially Aileen, who started engaging in inappropriate behavior to survive. She was reportedly assaulted by her own brother Keith and even her grandfather, who would force her to strip before beating her. By the time Aileen was 14, she had become pregnant after being assaulted by a family friend and was ultimately kicked out by her grandfather a year later. On her own, Aileen continued selling her body for money to survive, and in 1974, at 18, Aileen was arrested for the first time for driving under the influence of alcohol, firing a gun from a vehicle, and disorderly conduct, thereby kickstarting her life in crime. Over the next couple of years, Aileen made life-altering decisions that included getting married to 69-year-old Louis Gratz Fell in 1976 and the marriage getting annulled after 9 weeks. After the death of her brother the same year, Aileen received $10,000 from his life insurance, and she proceeded to spend it on short-lived luxuries. After attempting to take her own life 6 times, Aileen surged ahead and fell deeper into crime, leading to several arrests for robberies, car theft, restriction of justice, resisting arrests, and even a forged check. By the time she was 35, Aileen had become deeply rooted in criminal activities and had murdered 7 men in just 1 year, all of which she claimed were in self-defense. The end of Aileen's criminal acts came in 1990, after she and her partner and lover, Tyria Moore, crashed the car of one of their victims and was spotted by a witness. Rhonda Bailey, who spotted the pair, gave the descriptions to the authorities, leading to a manhunt that ended with the arrest of the pair in 1991. 3 days later, Aileen admitted to the murders, claiming the victims had tried to assault her and she simply defended herself. In January 1992, Aileen was put on trial for the murder of Richard Charles Mallory, with lots of evidence pointing out other crimes she had committed. Although she was ruled mentally unstable, she was sentenced to death after a few weeks. While on death row, Aileen showed no remorse for her actions and claimed she would do it again if given the chance. She was executed by lethal injection in October 2002 after declining the offer of a last meal and opted for a cup of coffee instead. Mary Flora Bell. As children, some of the things we thought about were getting the most colorful toys, clothes, and shoes, and eating the sweetest of things. For Mary Flora Bell, however, other, more sinister thoughts consumed her mind as a child. Known as the youngest serial killer in Britain, Mary killed for the first time when she was just 10 years old. While diagnosed with a psychopathic personality disorder, Mary's behavior was directly influenced by her upbringing and early formative years. Born in May 1957 to Elizabeth Becky Bell, a popular local prostitute, Mary suffered neglect and ill treatment at the hands of her parents. As a baby, toddler, and child, Mary was regularly injured, drugged, and abused by her mother, who was a dominatrix. In the mid-60s, Mary was forced by her mother to orally please her clients, and in most cases, was bound and blindfolded to do so. All of these seriously affected Mary's psyche and made her temperamental, moody, violent, and dangerous to other children around her. At this time, Mary had developed an unhealthy fascination with strangulation and choking and had attempted to strangle other children who played with her. Eventually, her fantasies were accomplished when she strangled 4-year-old Martin Brown in an upstairs bedroom of an abandoned property on May 1968. Although she had become friends with her 13-year-old neighbor, Norma Bell, Mary carried out this act alone. A few weeks later, after her 11th birthday, Mary struck again. And this time, her victim was 3-year-old Brian Howe. An autopsy revealed that Brian had died of strangulation and that the killer had covered his nose while they strangled him. Due to the amount of force speculated to have been applied on the boy, the killer was assumed to be a child as well. The death of Howe and the fact that the killer was a child caused a manhunt and a series of questioning on children in the area. Mary and Norma were brought in and questioned after several witnesses confessed to seeing the girls play with the boy around the time he disappeared. Initially, the girls were not suspected, but everything became clear when Mary made a statement that incriminated herself in a bid to push the blame on someone else. After Norma was taken in for questioning a second time, she finally admitted to being present when Mary snuffed the life out of Howe. Although she was not directly involved herself, both Mary and Norma were apprehended, charged for the murder, and evaluated. The test results showed that Norma was intellectually challenged while Mary was bright, but had a psychotic disorder. After a trial that lasted only 9 days, Norma was acquitted of all charges, while Mary was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to be detained indefinitely, making her the youngest female serial killer in Britain, a record that still stands today. For her sentence, Mary spent more than 11 years in prison before her release in 1980 at the age of 23. After her release, Mary was granted anonymity and allowed to start a new life under an assumed identity. Gemma Mitchell. The popular saying, "Your best friend can be your worst enemy," has never been more true than in the case of Gemma Mitchell, an Australian woman currently serving a life sentence for the decapitation and murder of her friend. Gemma was born on July 22, 1984 in Australia, and was raised there with her sister. When the marriage of her parents ended, Gemma moved to the United Kingdom in the early 2000s with her mother and sister. During her time in the UK, Gemma studied osteopathy and relocated to Australia to practice. In 2015, Gemma relocated back to the UK, but could not practice because she was not registered. Sometime in 2020, Gemma met and became friends with Mi Quinn Chong in a church they both attended. Although both women lived in the UK, Chong was originally from Malaysia and was a widowed woman who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Chong trusted Gemma enough and believed that she was helping her manage her situation spiritually. Not long after the women became friends, Gemma and her mother got scammed of £230,000 by two builders they had hired to work on their property. As a friend, Chong stepped in to help by offering £200,000 to Gemma, but later withdrew her offer and advised her to sell the property instead. Offended, Gemma traveled to Chong's house in North London on June 11, 2021 with a large blue suitcase and killed her. She stuffed Chong's body in the suitcase and brought it back to the property she shared with her mother. Unfortunately, Chong's body was not the only thing Gemma took from her house after killing her. Gemma also took important documents from Chong's house and attempted to use them to forge Chong's will. If she had succeeded, she would have inherited a huge part of the deceased £700,000 estate. Killing Chong was not the only terrible thing Gemma did, as she stored the suitcase in the garden of the house she shared with her mother for 2 weeks. On June 26, 2021, Gemma reactivated Chong's phone and used it to hire a car, with which she drove 200 miles to dispose of the body and decapitated head. Chong's body was discovered the next day by holidaymakers, while her head was found days later. After being left in a suitcase to decompose, the state of Chong's body was pitiful. Autopsy and fragments from her skull showed she was either pushed onto a protruding object or hit with one. As a prime suspect, Gemma was arrested on July 6, 2021, and charged with the murder of Chong. After being on trial for months, Gemma was found guilty of the murder of her friend Chong, with monetary gain being her motive. Due to the gravity of the situation, her sentencing was televised live on October 28, 2022, with the whole world bearing witness to Gemma Mitchell being sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years. Sharon Carr. This lady is so twisted that she is nicknamed the Devil's Daughter due to the nature of her violence. After killing for the first time at just 12 years old, Sharon bragged about the act and even went as far as attempting to kill another person before she was finally apprehended. During her questioning sessions, Sharon shared the delight she felt with officers when she murdered her first victim, leaving them to wonder where it all went wrong with her. The answer to that question would not be so easy, as Sharon was suspected to be a psychopath, and perhaps the devil himself. Born in December 1979, Sharon was one of 4 children who grew up in abject poverty. After a domestic violence incident between her mother and stepfather that ended with her mother pouring boiling fat over her stepfather, Sharon's life changed, and not for the better. Initially described as a kind and polite girl, Sharon became an entirely different person, but the true extent was not known until much later. On June 7, 1992, Sharon stabbed and killed 18-year-old Katie Ratcliffe on her way home in the early hours of the morning. Katie, who was a stranger to Sharon, was reportedly stabbed 32 times by Sharon in her heart, ribs and private area, with a 6.5-inch knife before her body was dumped by a cemetery wall. Due to the nature and brutality of the stab wounds on her private area, the crime was believed to be sexually motivated, and the criminal was assumed to be a full-grown male. Because no one suspected her, Sharon returned to school as if nothing happened. 2 years later, she made another move to kill. On June 7, 1994, Sharon attacked a 13-year-old student in the bathroom for no apparent reason, stabbing her in the back and puncturing her lungs. She would have succeeded in killing her if it were not for the intervention of 5 students who entered the bathroom in time to stop the attack. Swift action was taken, and Sharon was arrested, after which she confessed to killing animals and even beheading a dog with a shovel. After her arrest, Sharon was sent to a medical center for evaluation, but after attempting to strangle 2 staff and other females in the detention unit, she was then transferred to Bullwood Hall Young Offenders Institution, an all-boys unit. It was after her transfer to Bullwood Hall that she started bragging about killing Katie. On hearing these rumors, Sharon's diaries and drawings were seized, and to the horror of those who found them, the contents showed her happiness and satisfaction at the killing of Katie. In May 1996, Sharon was put on trial for the murder of Katie, and after 1 month was convicted and sentenced to 14 years for her crime. While in prison, Sharon continued to attack fellow inmates and even staff members, and has remained incarcerated even after the expiration of her sentence. It is believed she remains a danger to society and will not be released just yet. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. History has shown that women are just as capable of violence and mayhem as men are. In this image, a woman seated in a glass compartment wearing nothing but her undergarments evoked several questions in people's minds. Is she sane, or is she mentally challenged? Is she subjected to some kind of experiment, or is she being held in the enclosed glass space as punishment for a crime? While the exact identity of the woman is a mystery, you cannot help but notice the peculiar way she is seated, as if staring at something in front of her. This leaves you wondering why anyone would be subjected to such situations unless she is guilty of an unimaginable crime, or is one of the world's most dangerous women held in captivity and forbidden to interact with anyone. As we dwell on the secrets of her condition, we cannot help but ask, what happened to her clothes? Andrea Yates. The worst kind of crimes are the ones committed against the weak and vulnerable, especially children. Andrea Yates, a former class valedictorian, an officer in the National Honor Society, and an all-around good woman, was convicted for the murder of her 5 children in 2001. But how Andrea fell so far from a decorated person to a child killer is mind-baffling and scary. During her teenage years, Andrea suffered from depression and bulimia, but did not really get enough treatment and therapy for it. She met and dated Russell Yates, a NASA engineer, and after a couple of years, the couple got married in 1993, with Andrea settling into marriage like any other woman would. As devout evangelical Christians, Andrea and her husband decided to have as many children as possible. A year after their marriage, the couple welcomed their first child in 1994 and had more children in the years that followed. In 1999, after the birth of their 4th child, Andrea was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis and tried to commit suicide by taking an overdose of pills. Fortunately, she was found by her husband and hospitalized before being given a series of antidepressants that stabilized her. Against the advice from their doctors, Andrea got pregnant again. After the birth of their 5th and final child in 2000 and the subsequent death of her father in 2001, Andrea became hysterical and stopped taking her medication entirely. On June 20th, 2001, Andrea filled the bathtub with water and drowned all 5 of her children after her husband left her alone to watch the children against the doctor's orders. Starting with the 2nd child, John, Andrea killed her children and laid their bodies on the bed, except for her 1st child, whom she left floating in the tub. When she was done, she called the police and her husband and asked him to come home immediately. Although it was undeniably true that Andrea was psychotic, she was tried for the murder of her children, and she pleaded not guilty because of insanity. After 3 days of deliberation, Andrea was found not guilty and released on bail only on the condition that she be admitted to a mental health care facility. While in a mental facility, Russell filed for a divorce in 2004, and it was granted in 2005. Joanna Den. The story of Joanna Den makes us understand one thing, and that is the fact that crime, violence, and murder are often always a choice. For a woman who killed just for the fun of it, Joanna showed a sadistic side that is still a mystery to the public. Along with her accomplice Gary Richards, Joanna had just one goal: to murder 9 men in the most brutal way imaginable. Fortunately for the world, and unfortunately for her, she was apprehended way before she achieved that number. But the questions on everyone's mind was what set Joanna on this path of bloodshed and killing, and what would have happened if she met her target of 9 bodies. Growing up, she did not have the best of childhoods, but after running away from home at 16 with her 21-year-old boyfriend, Joanna's life continued the path of violence it started on. Despite her troubled life, she got pregnant twice with her partner trainer and hated it because she did not want any children. Due to the series of personal abuse she subjected herself to, Traynor left her and took the children with him because he feared for their lives and the toxicity of being around their mother. Sure enough, his fears were proven when Joanna met Gary and got into serious problems that led to her arrest in 2012 at the age of 29. Shortly after her release, Joanna embarked on a 10-day killing spree, intending to kill at least 9 men. Her murder spree started with 31-year-old Lukas Slaboszewski, whom she lured to a house and blindfolded after they had gone out for a drink, and proceeded to stab in the heart before dumping his body in a dumpster. Days later, Joanna continued her killing spree with her neighbor and landlord being the latest victims. While Joanna carried out the acts of stabbing her victims, her accomplices Gary and Leslie Layton helped her dispose of the bodies. After attacking and stabbing 2 men who were walking their dogs, Joanna was arrested and confessed to the actions, stating she only targeted men because she was a mother herself and did not want to harm other women or mothers. But after killing her first victim, she developed a taste for it and wanted more. While she waited for her trial, Joanna noted in her diary an escape plot where she planned to attack and cut off the finger of a prison guard and use the severed finger to escape the biometric system. Without hesitation, Joanna was charged and taken to court, where she pled guilty to everything she was charged with. This led to her being sentenced to life in prison with the judge ordering she never be released. She is currently serving her term at HM Prison Bronzefield. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.